So now on to our keynote. Fascinating Dr. Michael Finster. He's an interventional cardiologist and a professional chef. He's a professor. He's from Montana. And he is working at the University of Montana. He's done several speaking events. He has reached out on television and other media. And how is what we eat is what we are. He has worked with the World Health Organization. He's helped people learn better about what they're doing. He has spent several years looking for the best way to bring about culinary medicine for people who need it most. Years in development, the result is The Healing Table. It's a novel, it's a person-centered way, internet-based software that gets to the heart of what we eat and who we are. Maybe we can just learn from him the secret behind the Greeks, the Vikings, and these other heroes in the past and what they ate. Did it make a difference? Maybe we will learn from Dr. Finster what Patrick Mahomes should have had for breakfast. Dr. Finster.
Thanks, Ernie. Viva Las Vegas! Welcome. There are so many people here. This is so great on a early morning in Las Vegas. I think you all need to give yourself a hand just for making it down here this morning. So go ahead, a round of applause for you. And let me be amongst the first to welcome you to the conference. While some of you may engage in activities that require that what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, no judgments, I am hopeful this talk is not amongst them. In fact, I'm hopeful that what you hear today encourages you to share this information with colleagues, clients, and customers when you return home. Now, I always like to start with a brief survey so we can all get to know each other just a bit better. So just by a show of hands, have you ever solicited or received dietary advice? I think just about every hand should be up. Again, with a show of hands, has said advice at one time or another caused you at least some degree of confusion? Yeah, me too. I love it when we're all in this together. Here's a classic example from just last year of how it usually goes. You've all probably experienced the recent push to consume more protein for better health. A study comes out, like this one from the folks at Harvard and other highly respected places, and the recommendation to the public is to eat more protein for better health. Literally, 1 month later, there's another published study from another group of experts warning you that eating more protein will cause a heart attack. Okay, next survey question. Again, just a quick show of hands. Does anyone recognize this person? Anyone? Anyone? Bueller? Anyone? Here's a clue. He is why children in the inner city can drink milk. Anyone yet? Pasteur? Okay, you win the prize. That's right. It's Louis Pasteur, discoverer of microbes and of the pasteurization process. Now, last survey question. Does anyone recognize this gentleman who is a contemporary of Louis Pasteur? I didn't think you would. His name is Dr. Ignaz Semmelweis. He was a Hungarian physician in the mid-19th century. During the mid-1800s, he served as director of obstetrical services at the Vienna General Hospital, which was established in 1784 in Vienna, Austria. During the 19th century, the Vienna General Hospital was one of Europe's most respected hospitals and training institutions. Unlike today, during that time, women who could afford it did not go to the hospital. They gave birth at home, tended to by midwives. The women who utilized the hospital's maternity services tended to be poor, single women from the lower social classes. In a society that disparaged unwed mothers, these women were often left to fend for themselves. And despite supportive hospital services, Dr. Semmelweis reported mortality rates of about 10 to 20% at the Vienna General Hospital's first obstetrical clinic, which was staffed by physicians and medical students. As a point of comparison, the current U.S. mortality rate is about 0.02 to about 0.03%. A leading cause of death amongst these hospitalized women was what was referred to as puerperal fever, which was second only to tuberculosis as a leading cause of death. If a woman entered the hospital in 1847, she had a 50-50 chance of leaving alive. But as horrific as that wasn't what bothered Semmelweis. What bothered him was that the women who were admitted to the second obstetrical clinic, run strictly by midwives, had a rate of puerperal fever 1/4 of that seen in the ward run by doctors and medical students. Semmelweis noted an extraordinarily high incidence of puerperal fever amongst women treated by these medical students. Many of these medical students had just come from dissecting cadavers and proceeded to assist in deliveries without any hand washing in between. That was because the predominant theory regarding the cause of such illnesses as puerperal fever was the miasma theory. The miasma theory was a medical belief dating back to the time of Hippocrates that diseases such as puerperal fever and others were caused by miasma, or bad air. This bad air came from a foul environment like contaminated water and unwholesome space or dirty conditions. Infections were not believed to be the result of personal contact, but the result of the local atmosphere. Semmelweis's genius was not only in recognizing the link between physicians and medical students working on dead bodies and then delivering babies whose mothers later died from puerperal fever, but also in developing an effective intervention and documenting it. In 1847, Semmelweis developed a mandatory policy of hand washing with a chlorinated solution to combat the transmission of what he called cadaverous particles to the new mothers. Over the next 2 years, the results were nothing short of miraculous. In 1849, Semmelweis reported a mortality rate of less than 5%. That was an almost 85% reduction in mortality from a mortality rate of 32% documented just 5 years earlier in 1842. For all his efforts and successes, Semmelweis was fired from the Vienna General Hospital on March 20th, 1849. His findings were widely ignored, rejected, and even worse, repudiated with disdain. His theory of cadaverous particles ran counter to the science of the day, which, as mentioned, attributed puerperal fever to miasma. Furthermore, Semmelweis's implication that it was the physicians themselves who were causing the disease by acting as a vector for the cadaverous particles infuriated the sensibilities of the gentlemen physicians of the time. Following his dismissal, professional and personal stressors continued to take their toll on Semmelweis's physical and mental health. In mid-July 1865, his wife felt he was acting out of character, and at her urging, he was examined by his friend and pediatrician, Dr. Bokai. Dr. Bokai then determined that Dr. Semmelweis needed further specialist attention. Subsequently, on July 29th, 1865, Dr. Bokai and 2 other physicians wrote a referral letter committing Semmelweis to a Viennese asylum. The following day, on July 30th, 1865, Dr. Ignaz Semmelweis set out at the behest of his wife to ostensibly visit a German spa via an overnight train to Vienna. In Vienna, he was met by another colleague, the dermatologist Ferdinand Ritter von Hebra, who then surreptitiously committed him to the public sanatorium just outside of Vienna. He attempted to leave, but following a scuffle, was placed in a straitjacket and detained against his will. At the time of his commitment, there's no evidence that anyone examined or even interviewed him. He died 14 days later on August 13th, 1865. His body, ironically, was sent for an autopsy in the very same morgue where years earlier he had sought to determine the cause of puerperal fever. His cause of death was a bacterial infection, the etiology of puerperal fever. The autopsy report noted an acute gangrenous osteomyelitis on the middle finger of the right hand and a metastatic abscess extending into the left thorax. Within the left thorax, an ichor source the size of a man's fist was found. The wounds and subsequent infection were believed to be the results and consequences of the melee that had occurred during his commitment to the asylum. The eventual vindication of Semmelweis had begun just a few years prior to his passing in 1861, when our friend Louis Pasteur first introduced his germ theory with the publication of Memoir on the organized corpuscles that exist in the atmosphere. Semmelweis was fully exonerated roughly a decade after his death, when Louis Pasteur published his follow-up paper titled The Germ Theory and Its Application to Medicine and Surgery in 1878. In that paper, he identified the causative role of microorganisms, Semmelweis's cadaverous particles, in diseases like puerperal fever. Pasteur also advocated for the antiseptic techniques of Joseph Lister, who recommended, of all things, hand washing in medical practices. The results of Pasteur, Lister, and others who followed forever closed the door on miasma theory. At the time of his death, Semmelweis was 47 years old. His legacy lives on ignominiously as the Semmelweis reflex. This is an acknowledged cognitive and social phenomenon that involves the reflex-like rejection of new knowledge because it contradicts entrenched norms, beliefs, or paradigms. It is the propensity to reject new ideas if they challenge established ones, no matter how compelling and solid the evidence is. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. Mike, come on. That was the mid-1800s. This is the 21st century. We know how to do real science now, and we don't go off half-cocked with hyperbolic quarantines and plague masks because of supposed bad air. Let's fast forward 100 years to the latter half of the 20th century. It was April 16th, 1977, and the first ever West Coast Computer Fair had just opened in San Francisco. At one of the booths, there was a young man named Steve Jobs. Maybe you've heard of him. He was selling a personal computer called the Apple II for about $1,300, roughly $7,000 in today's money. It was a rather humble and inauspicious beginning to the computer revolution that would transform the modern world in the coming decades. On August 12, 1981, at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in Midtown Manhattan, the 8th largest company in the world, IBM, affectionately known as Big Blue, with revenues of almost $30 billion, finally entered the personal computer marketplace with the Model 5150 PC. Given its vast resources, including some of the best and brightest business and technical minds of the time, IBM initially dominated the PC arena with an over 80% market share in the early 1980s, following its foray into the marketplace. By 1985, IBM was the world's most lucrative company with profits of over $6.5 billion, and their chairman of the board was on the cover of Time magazine. But the IBM giant had feet of clay. IBM's business success had been built on mainframes and servers, a technology dating back to the 1950s. IBM's entrenched corporate structure separated the nascent personal computer group from the established mainframe division, causing mainframe salespeople to reject the PC as all too often they viewed it as competition. However, shortly after its introduction, corporate customers noted that the cost of performing calculation on a PC was often significantly cheaper than on a mainframe. That self-evident reality foreshadowed dire economic consequences. But IBM's senior management continued to see the world through mainframe glasses. Leadership continued to base its PC market approach on that used for corporate mainframes. From the inception of the computer age, IBM had ruled every phase of the development of the computer industry, including hardware and software. Following the introduction of the PC, IBM leadership followed the same standard game plan, which had reliably produced corporate success year after year. What they could not recognize, what they refused to recognize, was that the landscape had changed. As IBM insider David Bradley observed, IBM became a company in denial. It couldn't believe it was no longer the dominant force in computing. Its corporate culture had become irrelevant in the new marketplace. By 1993, IBM was reporting quarterly losses of $8 billion. In December 2004, less than 2 decades after dominating the PC business, IBM's computer dynasty crumbled as it withdrew from the PC market and sold its remaining PC business to the Chinese company Lenovo. So what do infection, hand washing, and the corporate failure of Big Blue have in common? It is an aspect of human nature at least as old as Homo sapiens sapiens itself, if not older. Homophily. Homophily is used in sociology and by social scientists to refer to the tendency of individuals to associate and bond with others who are similar to themselves. In other words, we like to be around people like us, both in thought and action. Although opposites may occasionally attract, the rule of thumb, at least when it comes to humans, is that birds of a feather flock together. Or, as the American moral and social philosopher Eric Hoffer observed, when people are free to do as they please, they usually imitate each other. As social primates, this can be a useful survival and evolutionary mechanism. Hundreds of thousands of years ago, our ancestors all agreed that bringing a saber-toothed tiger to dinner was a bad idea, likely because one of them would become dinner. The result was that the whole tribe lived a little longer, and this consensus led to stronger social bonds due to a shared perspective. However, this becomes a problem, for example, when a group of medical experts employs the Semmelweis reflex, excluding different viewpoints or perspectives because they challenge existing dogma. In the case of IBM executives, promoting those blindly adherent to the dominant corporate logic created an echo chamber without a variety of thought. Such a lack of cognitive diversity leads to groupthink. That can subsequently cause the collapse of a system. This can be understood in terms of a positive feedback loop. Once groupthink is established, positive feedbacks are enabled. One of the feedbacks that is enabled is selection. Those who preach and practice the dominant logic are more likely to be promoted to positions of power and authority. This creates a management culture that can become dogmatically adherent to the dominant logic. This perception of reality then flows from the top down to permeate the entire organization's philosophy. The consequence is that all information is viewed and evaluated through a singular lens. IBM's dominant logic was that the future was based on mainframe computers. This caused them to ignore the potential of the personal computer revolution, despite having a leadership composed of the best and brightest business and technology minds of the time. Our modern approach to nutrition has followed a similar course. Much like the early success of IBM was based upon mainframe computers, the early success of nutrition was based on the relatively simple system dynamics of nutrients and deficiency disease. Now, nutrition is a young science that originated in the early 20th century. Its birth can, arguably, be traced to the identification of the first vitamin by the Polish scientist Casimir Funk in 1912. He called this nutrient, an essential nutrient, a vital amine from which our modern word vitamin or vitamin derives. He identified vitamin B1 or thiamine. Funk had isolated a substance from rice bran that could prevent and cure beriberi, a tremendously significant, debilitating, and widespread disease at the time. It was so prevalent, particularly in Asia, that it was often referred to as the national disease of Japan. In 1933, the British chemist Sir Walter Norman Hayworth succeeded in synthesizing the first vitamin, vitamin C, or ascorbic acid. This was followed by the practice of supplementation and fortification. The result was that by the 1960s and the early 1970s, the prevalence of deficiency diseases like beriberi and scurvy had been tremendously reduced worldwide. The success of this approach entrenched it as the predominant mechanism of nutrition studies by which to examine the food-health relationship. At the same time in the 1980s that IBM was doubling down on the mainframe, this reductionist, nutrient-centric approach, labeled as nutritionism by Professor Scrinis, was adopted by the government, preeminent institutions, and research leaders as the preferred and, according to some, the only valid scientific method by which to evaluate food and health. It became and has remained the dominant logic. It examines a single nutrient and a single effect. In the setting of deficiency diseases, this correlates to finding that a lack of X nutrient below a certain threshold value causes disease Y. Restoring X at or above the threshold abolishes or prevents the disease state. This can be accomplished without using whole foods through the process of supplementation or fortification of synthesized compounds. Nutritionism is a form of reductionism, which is the practice of analyzing and describing a complex phenomenon in terms of phenomena that are held to represent a simpler or more fundamental level, especially when this is said to provide a sufficient explanation. The nutritionism form of reductionism emphasizes the individual nutrients within food rather than the food itself. In the 1980s, as IBM continued to back a mainframe solution, this concept became entrenched in nutrition science. This is when dietary discussions shifted from any discussion of whole foods to focus on specific nutrients. This focus of evaluating the health benefits of food strictly in terms of its constituent nutrients continues to dominate contemporary discussions and approaches. A significant issue with this methodology is that it ignores the broader context of food and its impact on human health. A nutrient-centric focus can lead to misconceptions about the healthfulness of certain foods and may overshadow the importance of overall dietary patterns, food quality, and the import of the food experience. That is because the linear reductionism of nutrientism equates the sum as merely equal to the parts, and thus it focuses on isolating nutrients, analyzing and emphasizing single nutrients to determine a food's health value, often promoting specific nutrients as beneficial or harmful, heroes and villains, winners and losers. For example, proteins versus fats and antioxidants versus cholesterol. It focuses on simplistic health associations, trying to establish direct cause and effect relationships between individual nutrients and health outcomes. This overlooks the complexities of whole foods and dietary patterns. It focuses on supplementation or avoidance, encouraging the use or avoidance of isolated nutrient supplements to address health issues, neglecting the benefits of whole foods. It overlooks food synergy, disregarding the interactions between the various components within whole foods that can influence their overall health effects. It ignores the influence of food production, the fact that creating ultra-processed foods designed for profit and shelf life deliver or remove specific nutrients, altering the natural food matrix, and impacting overall dietary quality. While the reductionist approach has contributed to understanding nutrient deficiencies and their health impact, it oversimplifies the multifaceted relationships between diet and health. If we approach the problem from a systems perspective, we can view the food-health relationship as a system that exists as a landscape in which the optimum situation can be described as a best view. In other words, the goal is to find a path that takes us to the highest point in the landscape. A simple system, such as we've described using the reductionist approach of nutritionism, can be visualized as a Mount Fuji landscape. In this model, there is a single, isolated peak to climb. In terms of deficiency disease, optimization is achieved by ensuring minimal levels of the desired nutrients are consumed. In extrapolating that to the nutritionism approach, the underlying principle becomes that optimum health can be achieved by simply consuming more desirable nutrients like proteins or avoiding so-called dietary baddies like cholesterol and saturated fat. The result of a half-century of using nutritionism to address the epidemic of chronic disability and disease has been further discord, disorder, disability, and disease. If we use type 2 diabetes as a representative illness of chronic disabilities and diseases, we can see the exponential rise in prevalence that has occurred following the adoption of recommendations based on the current nutritionism template. Currently, over 60% of Americans suffer from at least one chronic disease, such as diabetes, cardiovascular disease, cancer, or Alzheimer's type dementia. And almost half, 42%, have 2 or more chronic conditions. That is up 27% from just back in 2018. These chronic diseases currently account for about 90% of America's $4.5 trillion annual healthcare expenditure. Over 80,000 cancer cases, over 80% of early heart attacks and strokes, and over 90% of type 2 diabetes are believed to be preventable with lifestyle modifications and interventions such as diet. Beyond the increased morbidity and mortality, beyond the immense personal suffering, the economic costs are staggering. Just obesity and diabetes alone cost the United States about $500 billion a year in direct and indirect medical cost. According to research, over 70% of all cases of type 2 diabetes have their etiology associated with poor dietary choices, particularly the consumption of ultra-processed foods. The average American consumes almost 70% of their diet in the form of ultra-processed foods, and research suggests this increases their risk of developing type 2 diabetes from 30 to almost 75%. As of last month, January 2025, there are 13 cohort studies correlating UPF consumption and type 2 diabetes, 5 in Europe, 4 in the US, 1 each in Australia, Brazil, Canada, and Korea. All of them show a positive association between ultra-processed food consumption and developing type 2 diabetes. If we look at ultra-processed food consumption and the rise in the prevalence of type 2 diabetes, we can see how they've tracked together over time. Now, one caveat, before the year 2000, there's a lack of direct data regarding the consumption of ultra-processed foods, so these values represent the best estimate based on the available evidence. At the same time that the US was buying low-fat Twinkies, the USSR was buying tanks. Now, there are multiple reasons behind the economic collapse of the Soviet Union, but experts agree that continued significant expenditures on the military was an important contributing factor. In the preceding decades, and at the time of its collapse, the USSR was estimated to have been spending between 12 and 20% of GDP on the military through the 1980s and into the early 1990s. We have been spending equivalent amounts on healthcare for the last 2 decades. Healthcare spending in the US rose to 7.5% in 2023 to 4.8 trillion, according to federal data, outpacing the projected annual gross domestic product growth rate of 6.1%. Spending is set to grow an average of 5.6% a year between now and 2032. Again, outpacing the projected annual GDP growth rate of 4.3% during the same period. The rise will increase healthcare spending share of GDP to almost 20% by 2032. This is not sustainable, especially when we don't get a good return on our investment. We are one of the top global spenders on healthcare as a percentage of GDP, and costs are on the rise. For all our modern technology and spending, we rank amongst the worst countries in the world in terms of maternal mortality. Ignaz Semmelweis would no doubt be truly disappointed. We are also currently 49th in life expectancy and trending downward. We are currently below Costa Rica and Chile. The US also has the world's largest healthspan-lifespan gap at 12.4 years. The healthspan-lifespan gap is a measure that represents the number of years prior to death that an individual suffers with disability or disease. In terms of our overall healthcare quality, we lag way behind other countries. When we look at what we spend as a percentage of GDP and what we get in return, the US is a clear outlier. And if we compare apples to apples by looking at similar economies, the data only gets worse. And the future, in terms of the chronic disease burden, only gets darker. According to a recent Harvard study, within the next few decades, what we are currently dealing with will look like a ripple in the pond compared to the oncoming tsunami. The absolute numbers are staggering and suggest that by the year 2060, compared with 2025, the number of people with obesity, diabetes, hypertension, coronary artery disease, and stroke will increase, with obesity increasing by roughly 20% to 126 million. Type 2 diabetes increasing by almost 40% to 55 million, and hypertension increasing by over 30% to 162 million. This results, in terms of cardiovascular disease, currently the #1 cause of death in the United States and other industrialized nations, as an increase in CAD by over 30% to 29 million, and an increase in stroke by approximately 35% to 15 million. These results, unsurprisingly, will disproportionately affect racial and ethnic minorities. Once again, unsustainable numbers. We are quite literally on the edge of a national health and economic precipice. But given the current drivers of the system, we are not simply standing at the edge. This is not a static system that we can avoid by doing nothing. You and I, all of us, we are Thelma and Louise with the pedal to the metal. Currently, we use various forms of reductionism, particularly nutritionism, to describe our food-health relationship. This reductionistic approach, as we mentioned, attempts to analyze a complex system like the food experience in simpler terms. But as H.L. Mencken warned us, there is always a well-known solution for every human problem, neat, plausible, and wrong. And Einstein further cautioned us that nature makes things as simple as possible, but no simpler. In other words, for every one thing we overcomplicate, we oversimplify 9 others. And the resounding and epic failures of addressing the food health equation over the last half-century must encourage us to seek out and engage new perspectives. And that means approaching the problem in terms of complex systems. A complex system refers to a system that is composed of numerous interconnected and interdependent elements, often exhibiting emergent collective behavior that cannot be fully understood by examining the individual components in isolation. Complex systems are abundant in society, in nature, and particularly in biology. Key characteristics of such systems include nonlinearity, feedback loops, self-organization, adaptation, and the capacity to exhibit emergent properties that result from the interactions of the system's components. Our food-health relationship is just such a system. We can imagine it as a landscape, not of a single isolated peak like Mount Fuji, but of interconnected mountains and valleys, like this image of the Bitterroot Mountains in Montana, which quite literally happens to be my backyard. Adding a timeline of pharmaceutical revenues as another variable gives us additional insights. Without delving too deeply into the weeds, what we can show is that all three variables are closely related, with the strongest correlations observed between diabetes prevalence and both UPF consumption and pharmaceutical revenues. This implies that as UPF consumption increases, diabetes prevalence rises, and then so do pharmaceutical revenues, indicating interconnected growth trends. The purpose here is not to establish causality beyond any doubt, but to provide a reasonable basis based on interdependencies upon which to predicate a systems model. A systems model is like a screwdriver bit. Based upon the scenario we're confronted with, we make some assumptions. Is it a flathead screw or a Phillips screw? And we select the best fit. If it doesn't work, we change the bit or the model. We refine our selection or model if it's the right shape, but not quite the correct size. The idea is to create as simple a model as possible that accurately reflects the system's drivers and allows us to make reasonably accurate predictions, including the effects of potential interventions. The model, like the screwdriver bit, is a tool to find the right answer. It is not the answer. Based on the data, relationships, and interdependencies discussed, we can construct a simple basic systems model as a tool to better understand the food-health relationship in terms of well-being and economics. If we examine UPF consumption, chronic disability and disease, or CDD, as represented by type 2 diabetes in our discussion, and pharmaceutical company revenues, what we see is a linked system. In constructing our system analysis, the first thing we do is set a border or a goalpost, which is the system boundary. There are many factors that impact and drive the manufacture of ultra-processed foods. For the sake of simplicity and clarity in developing our initial model, we'll put those out of bounds, on the back burner, and outside of our system's boundary. What we are focusing on is that ultra-processed food manufacturers make lots of ultra-processed food. These ultra-processed foods constitute almost 70% of the average American's diet. Thus, the consumers of UPFs are most Americans. Of those who consume significant quantities of ultra-processed food, a percentage of them will develop type 2 diabetes that would not have otherwise done so. These individuals then generate pharmaceutical revenues from the sale of anti-diabetic medications used to treat type 2 diabetes. The output of massive UPF consumption is increased type 2 diabetes. This becomes an input flow for pharmaceutical company revenues. Remarkably, within this linked system, there is essentially no economic reward, no driver, especially for patients and individuals, for maintaining good health. The purpose of the healthcare industry should be to optimize the health and well-being of the individual and the community in a sustainable way, including economically. Our current healthcare industry, as modeled here with respect to CDD, is clearly not driven by health and wellness as outputs, but driven by the continued profitability of disease management. When someone breaks a leg, we don't put them on crutches for the rest of their life to manage their infirmity. A surgeon operates and repairs the trauma. This is followed by a program of ancillary health services and rehab if needed. Barring complications, the system returns the patient to a preoperative level of function. There is no such pathway in the current paradigm of chronic disease management, despite widespread evidence that a significant percentage of CDD can be prevented, treated, and even reversed with lifestyle-focused interventions such as diet. The current model does provide a huge economic driver for continued chronic disease management. People who die quickly may bring in the short term a significant purchase. Think of the bill for someone in the last 24 hours life receiving maximum therapy in an intensive care unit setting. But they are not long-term repeat customers. That input for the disease management industry requires a steady flow of lifetime customers. In other words, those with CDD. That is the American Academy of Pediatrics recommending GLP-1 agonists like Ozempic as primary therapy for 12-year-old children. Recommendations that are currently FDA approved. That is research trials like the one published this September past that examine such interventions as primary therapy for children as young as 6 years old. Increasing UPF consumption creates a complex economic impact. It leads to increased healthcare costs, productivity losses, and a significant financial burden on individuals and public health systems, not to mention the human suffering of increased morbidity and mortality. At the same time, it generates tremendous revenues for the food and pharmaceutical industries. Some of these pharmaceutical revenues are depleted by flows outside of our other system boundary, our other goalpost for things like salaries, operating expenses, marketing, advertising, R&D, etc. Initiating change to improve healthcare outcomes begins not just by defining and acknowledging the system model and its stocks and flows, but also identifying critical feedback loops, both positive and negative, that impact the system. One of these positive feedback loops is driven by part of those pharma revenues being channeled into agents like multi-stakeholder institutions or MIs. Through actions like those involving global food governance, these agents act as a positive feedback loop for the manufacturer of more UPFs by influencing food and governmental policy, awarding research grants, and funding so-called public information programs, amongst other activities. When UPFs are purchased, that generates revenue for their manufacturers, which is another positive feedback for increasing their production. Part of UPF manufacturer revenues is also fed back into MIs, creating a third positive feedback loop. When viewed this way, one of the glaring anomalies is the lack of a negative feedback loop to impact and put the brakes on the manufacturer of UPFs. Likewise, there's a lack of effective agency in depleting the stock of UPF consumers through offering positive dietary and more healthful alternatives. But the beautiful thing about approaching this from a systems perspective is that, well, they're systems. And that means we can look across disciplines and apply solutions from other areas as diverse as economics and biological ecosystems. The question is, with the system currently on the brink, barreling toward the tipping point with no brakes, can an intervention at this point make a difference? The wolves, introduced simply to address deer and elk overpopulation, changed the very landscape of Yellowstone. They increased ecological diversity and offered opportunities for other species where none existed before. So the question arises, what are our wolves? We need to make economically viable solutions that address the root causes of chronic disability and diseases. We need to look for solutions beyond just the current status quo of disease management. If, for example, we institute programs and policies that encourage non-pharmacologic solutions, such as diet-based solutions and programs to increase physical activity, to those consumers of ultra-processed foods who develop chronic disability and diseases like type 2 diabetes, then a percentage of them will not need a pharmacologic solution. This acts as a negative feedback loop to reduce pharma revenues. However, positive economic reinforcers must accompany the implementation of such propositions. They must not only deliver results, but provide a financially viable model for the providers. This is what I refer to as an economic intervention for healthy profits. Within the ecosystem of Yellowstone Park, the wolf is a predator, taking the lives of deer and elk. But it is also a giver of life, providing an opportunity for other species like birds, foxes, and beavers to thrive. It is neither villain nor hero, as those are human judgments. It is simply a wolf. A functioning, profitable, and healthy pharmaceutical industry is critical to maintaining and improving the current level of healthcare services. Creating a feedback loop of healthy profits that also includes strategic business opportunities for pharmaceutical industry involvement promotes diversification from a pill for every ill model that currently predominates pharmaceutical industry strategy. Another potential intervention point is creating and supporting regional food nodes. Food cultures and consumption are local and regional phenomena. Regional food nodes offer a diverse food health conversation between nodes instead of central planning dictums from single sources like those currently delivered from Washington, D.C. Such a network could offer consumers of UPFs alternatives to diets that are currently mainly composed of junk food, fast food, and other ultra-processed offerings. This intervention serves as a negative feedback to decrease the pool of UPF consumers. This could be realized through several mechanisms. For example, local employers with cafeterias could instruct their food service staff to serve less ultra-processed meals and create menus with more healthful local and regional ingredients. Education at the local and regional levels could be reinforced through culinary medicine-focused demonstrations, lectures, and presentations held during food service hours and offered as after-hour events. Regional food nodes could also incorporate the existing networks of regional health systems and extend offerings, including educational opportunities, to healthcare professionals and to the public. A natural extension of such a systems approach is to include regional grocery stores and chains, many of which include pharmacies. Involvement as a regional food node, supplying ingredients consumers can purchase, could help offset any potential losses from the decreased sale of pharmaceuticals. Finally, creating firewalls through increased transparency, legislation, and consumer advocacy could help limit the untoward and overrepresented influence of entities like international multi-stakeholder institutions on global food governance. Increased disclosure and reporting could help identify potential conflicts of interest involving research, publication, and policy mandates. These are some examples of potential system breaks, our negative feedback loops, our wolves ready for release into the ecosystem. The current state of the system demands action. If we do nothing, it will collapse under its own weight. If we continue upon the same path that we have tread for the last 75 years, we will drop into the abyss like lemmings. The ancient and current purpose of healthcare is to sustainably and responsibly create better health and wellness for the individual and community, including economically. To paraphrase the British explorer Robert Swan, our greatest threat is the belief that someone else will do it. We must begin to act now by honestly assessing and defining the healthcare ecosystem as it currently exists. That means making bold choices and moving beyond the current borders of dominant logic. As the 17th century Japanese philosopher Matsuo Basho advised us, do not seek to follow in the footsteps of the wise, seek what they sought. We need to stop staring at the footsteps of where we have been and start charting a course to the horizons of where we need to go. And that is back to making healthcare about healthcare. Today, we've set our healing table. The invitations have been sent far and wide to pharmaceutical and medical device manufacturers, to healthcare systems and governmental agencies, to food manufacturers and grocery stores, and to every person who cares about their health and their loved ones. So let the feast and the conversation begin. Thank you for your attention.
Dr. Finster, thank you very much. There are microphones in the room. Please bring your questions to them. Here's a starting point.
Okay.
In this room, we manage and process benefits. We have a plan document that guides us into what a claim is, how to pay a claim. It gives information to the employee and to the employer. You've described a macro environment that we need to adopt. At the micro level, at the employer level, what do you suggest that we do in order to move an employer and his or her employees toward a more culinary goal?
Well, that's a great question. And obviously there are other alternatives. I'm going to kind of focus on the diet one, as you pointed out. But certainly if we can encourage, programs that have proved effectiveness, for example, in somebody who has, as I mentioned, somebody who has diabetes, incorporating dietary aspects, then they may eventually not need the medications, certainly prevents the complications. And so what we can do, particularly as providers to the employers who foot the bill for all these costs, is kind of do what the personal computer did for their corporate customers and showed that this is a cost-effective way. That's why they moved away from mainframes. So you have this behemoth, right? IBM telling everybody, got to do mainframes. But their customers are going, but wait, I'm realizing savings using this thing this guy named Steve Jobs just sold me. So maybe I'll go start looking at this. So we have to start, I think, exploring and implementing these in a way that provides, economical viability for the people who provide the services, and then demonstrate that this is a cost-effective solution. And then I think it becomes win-win. People are healthier. We're not taking drugs for the rest of our lives. I just got something in my mailbox this morning saying, here, a new list of complications to look for in GLP-1, agonists. And we're doing it in a way that impacts the system and it starts to put some brakes on it. Because right now, if we continue to do the same thing that we've always done, that's the very basis, the very definition of insanity.
Karen.
Thanks, Ernie. So this was very interesting to me because I am a person that cannot eat American flour due to genetic modification. And I'm very curious as to your opinion on Dr. McCary is up to be the head of the FDA. We understand that red dye has now been outlawed in 2028, right? So there are things that the FDA has approved, as you mentioned. What do you think is actually going to happen, though? Because you still have those entities out there that are allowing these modifications of our food supply to actually cause inflammatory diseases that are causing other things. We have increases in arthritis and all the inflammation. I've heard over and over from friends who have gone to Europe for a 2-week tour. They don't put on weight. They're not inflamed. They feel amazing. Do we all need to move to Europe?
Well, hearing the Rome analogy earlier made me long to go back. So, yeah, because I know this great gelato spot right near the Trevi Fountain. No, we don't. But even the way that Europe is approaching the problem is rooted in the way we approach nutrient deficiency diseases, 75 years ago. So we have to switch the paradigm, the very way that we're analyzing the problem. I heard from anecdotally, and there's evidence, and I'm happy to discuss later, exactly why, European flour is different and people don't have a lot of the effects. A lot of what's been marketed, for example, food manufacturers love things like low fat, gluten-free, et cetera, because they can charge you more for a specialty product than as manufacturers that they put that in the, on the shelf and they get more shelf space. A lot of this sort of gluten intolerance, gluten allergy probably has to do not with the gluten, which is an intrinsic property of all flours, all wheat-based flours, as well as spelt and rye and triticale, but has to do, as you said, with kind of the additives and the processing manufacture that it goes through. So I think we have to fundamentally change the way we're looking at it, because I'm sure you guys have all heard, right? It's protein this week, so it's avoid carbs next week, it's saturated fats. When that came out, what most healthcare providers will tell you is, well, the public just doesn't listen. But if you look at the data, the public's actually done everything that the guidelines have asked. We've statistically significantly reduced saturated fat consumption, red meat consumption, fat consumption, egg consumption, butter consumption, and yet we have exploding obesity and diabetes. So I think we have to fundamentally go back and look. And the organizations that I've been doing this for 30 years, talking about ultra-processed foods. And as you mentioned, the new administration, Marty and RFK Jr. in particular, talking about ultra-processed foods has kind of come to the highlight now. There's a lot of entrenched thought that doesn't want to even address this as sort of a topic. And I think we need to be able to move on and start looking at whole foods instead of just these nutrients. Because as you mentioned, what happens with the processed flour, there are fundamental alterations to the food matrix that happen when you ultra process, because you tear it down to add preservatives, flavorings, et cetera, and then you try to put that matrix back and it's altered. And food and us have a very intimate relationship that also involves a third party called our gut microbiome that has co-evolved to coexist and co-digest all these things that we eat over hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years. And all of a sudden, the things that we are putting into there, even if the nutrient label is exactly the same, even if the calories are the same, it's fundamentally different. And until we go back to kind of examining food and looking at it within a complex systems approach, that we now have the opportunity to do for a couple of reasons. One is the science has advanced in terms of, I'm old, so when I was in medical school, they were like, oh, this bacteria, it lives in your gut, it doesn't do anything. It just cleans out fiber you can't digest. Well now, right, we know it's like a third organ that is constantly in contact with our brain, our entire body, our immune system. It sends out hormones, bacterial products are messengers. So it's in constant communication. There's a constant exchange of information from everything we eat. And in fact, when you don't eat, your gut microbiome shifts and starts to send different messages. How well you exercise, that runner's high is actually dependent on your gut microbiome. Through the vagal afferent nerve, it sends signals to your brain. So there's tremendous ecosystem involvement. And until we start pulling this together and using a systems approach to understand food and health, it's not going to work. I mean, it's sort of like trying to, examine a car by simply looking at the spark plug, and is the spark plug the problem? Well, the spark plug's connected to the whatever lights a spark plug up, to the piston, and so on and so forth. And until we fundamentally move from what I would consider a clockwork way of looking at food and health, a Newtonian way of looking at food and health, and embracing a complex systems, a 21st century way of looking at, we're going to be stuck. So what I would be hopeful, as I talk to Marty after this, is that, in the FDA and RFK Jr., we start to enable and fund things that fundamentally look at food and health in a way beyond just a nutrient label. Labeling different kinds of sugar, outlawing red dye number 2 is great, but that's not really the problem.
That question came from Karen Rasnick with MedWatch. And as you do have a question, please announce your name and your association. And we've got time for a 30-second question, 30-second response.
Rick Scheel with WellDoc. We actually have a solution that's centered around GLP-1s and weight loss. So is the wolf RFK Jr.? Just your commentary on that, please.
No, I think the wolf are these negative feedbacks. GLP-1s are fine. I mean, they need for some people. I'm by training, my vocation for many years was an interventional cardiologist. I could not have done my job. I could not have stopped heart attacks without great products from the pharmaceutical industry. But once you stop the bleeding, right, you need a solution. When somebody came to me at 2 o'clock in the morning with a heart attack, that was not the time to talk to them about diet and maybe meditation to relieve stress. That was the time to get the damn artery opened. If somebody comes and they need a GLP-1, that's great. Use it for a month, 2 months, 4 months, 5 months, whatever. If they don't need it for other reasons like ongoing diabetes, then what's the solution? This idea that we're just going to feed them drugs for the rest of their life, that to me, that's not restoring health, that's disease management. And I will tell you that I do not personally believe 6-year-olds need to be put on Ozempic. I think we do not understand, and I just recently wrote an article to this effect. We have some general idea how they work in our brain, endocannabinoid, opioid systems, but we don't know specifically how they work. We don't know how it's affecting our brain. So you want to give a drug to a 6-year-old that's mind is not even formed, make them a lifetime customer when you can't even tell me the exact pathways by which this drug works? I think there are better solutions. So I'd say, our wolves are those negative feedback loops to put a brake on the system so that we have options and alternatives, and we use and give drugs to those people that need it, will benefit the most. And every drug should always be, at least as I was trained, a risk-benefit decision. Even taking an aspirin, right? It's been shown in multiple studies. Well, hey, doc, should I just take an aspirin every day? I don't have any heart disease. Well, it's going to increase your risk of winding up in the hospital with a GI bleed if you don't have the risk factors. Hey, doc, I just had a heart attack. You put a stent in. Well, you better take your aspirin every single day. Risk benefit, even for the simplest of drugs.
Dr.
Get one more?
Finster,
Okay. Thank you.
let's give him a hand.